The Lawson family tragedy began quietly, with subtle shifts and small signs that only became significant later. The events took place in 2021, centered around the small coastal town of Grey Haven, Maine. It was here that Maria Lawson vanished under circumstances that would leave the community questioning everything they thought they knew about the family. Maria Sullivan, born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1979, had moved to Maine in the summer of 2020 after marrying David Lawson. The two had met in Boston at a charity gala in August 2019, and their relationship moved quickly. David, born in Portland, Maine in 1975, was a successful businessman with deep ties to the region. His family's mansion in Grey Haven, built in 1893, stood as a testament to the Lawson family's long-standing presence in the state. David had been married before to Claire Lawson, whose death in August 2011 during a hiking trip in Acadia National Park cast a long shadow over the family. Claire's death was ruled accidental, but the case had never sat well with the locals. Whispers persisted about a possible argument on the cliffs that day, an argument that could have led to something more sinister. Nevertheless, the authorities had closed the case without further investigation, and David remained a respected figure in the community. By the time Maria moved into the Lawson mansion in June 2020, it was clear that her relationship with Abigail, David's daughter from his first marriage, would be a challenge. Abigail, born in Bar Harbor, Maine in 2004, was quiet and withdrawn, having grown up in the shadow of her mother's death. Described by neighbors and teachers as intelligent but aloof, Abigail rarely engaged with others, spending much of her time isolated, either at home or wandering the woods behind the mansion. The first signs of trouble in Maria's new life emerged shortly after the move. Friends in Boston, whom she frequently kept in touch with, reported that Maria seemed overwhelmed by the isolation of Grey Haven and the coldness of the house. By September 2020, she had expressed concerns about Abigail's behavior. In one conversation, Maria mentioned hearing Abigail talking to herself late at night. The voices would start around midnight, often faint at first, like a murmur, but growing louder as the hours passed. David Lawson dismissed these concerns. To him, Abigail's withdrawn behavior was a result of unresolved grief, not anything to worry about. The house itself, he explained, was old and full of noises, a common feature of such a historic building. David reassured Maria that with time, things would improve. But by November 2020, Maria had started to feel something far more unsettling in the house. One incident, reported by a longtime housekeeper, occurred on the night of December 3, 2020, around 11:30 p.m. Maria had been alone in the house with Abigail, as David was away on a business trip in New York City. She awoke to the sound of footsteps just outside her bedroom door. At first, she assumed it was the housekeeper, or perhaps Abigail heading to the kitchen, but the footsteps didn't fade away. Instead, they stopped just outside the door, lingering in place. Maria lay in bed waiting for the sound of someone moving again, but it didn't happen. Instead, there was a faint whispering, an eerie, low voice that seemed to come from down the hall. When Maria got up to investigate, she found Abigail standing at the far end of the upstairs hallway, facing the door to the attic. The girl was still, unmoving, as if in a trance. Maria called out to her, but Abigail didn't respond. After a long pause, she turned and walked silently back to her room, never saying a word. The following morning, Maria asked Abigail about the incident, but Abigail claimed not to remember any of it. She said she had slept through the night, never once waking. The housekeeper, who arrived that day, said Maria seemed shaken, but she kept her concerns private. On January 12, 2021, Maria discovered something that deepened her unease. While cleaning out the library, she found an old leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of dusty books. The journal had belonged to Claire Lawson, David's first wife, who had died nearly a decade earlier. The entries were sparse, but the later pages revealed a growing sense of dread. Claire had written about Abigail's increasingly strange behavior in the months before her death. In a final chilling entry dated July 27, 2011, Claire expressed her fear that Abigail was hiding something dark, and that she was no longer sure of her daughter's innocence in a series of disturbing events that had taken place before their fatal trip to Acadia National Park. Maria kept the discovery of the journal to herself. She was unsure of how to confront David or whether she even should, but the more she read, the more her unease grew. The house, with its locked attic and Abigail's late-night wanderings, felt as though it were slowly closing in around her. By late February 2021, Maria had become more isolated. She no longer called her friends in Cambridge as often, and when she did, her conversations were short, distracted. She was seen less frequently in town, and when she did appear, locals described her as looking tired, as if she hadn't slept in days. The housekeeper, who had worked for the family for years, noted that Maria often seemed to be standing by the windows for hours, staring blankly out at the fog-draped cliffs. The last significant sighting of Maria occurred on March 15, 2021, when she was seen driving into town to meet with an old friend. She seemed agitated, according to the friend, asking more questions about Claire's death than usual. Maria had begun to ask locals about the events surrounding Claire's accident, but most were reluctant to discuss it. Grey Haven was a town that kept its secrets well guarded, and the Lawson family was still a respected name, despite the shadow of Claire's death. By the morning of March 21, 2021, Maria Sullivan Lawson was gone. David reported her missing to the Maine State Police after returning from a brief business trip to Boston. According to his statement, he had come home late the night before to find the house empty, with no sign of Maria anywhere. Her car was still parked in the driveway, and her belongings were untouched. The investigation would uncover far more than anyone expected. The investigation into Maria Lawson's disappearance began on March 21, 2021. By all accounts, Maria had simply vanished. Her purse was still in the house, her car untouched in the driveway, yet there were no signs of a struggle. The house, despite its cold and imposing nature, appeared undisturbed. Detective Eleanor Bryce, a seasoned investigator from Portland, was assigned to the case. She arrived at the Lawson mansion on the afternoon of March 22nd and was immediately struck by the eerie stillness of the place. The house felt empty, but not in the way one might expect when someone has gone missing. It was as though the air itself had absorbed whatever tension had existed between Maria and her stepdaughter Abigail. David Lawson was cooperative, at least initially. He recounted his return from Boston on the night of March 20th, finding the house empty and assuming Maria had gone into town for a late errand or visit with a friend. When she still hadn't returned by the following morning, David said he grew worried and called the police. Bryce interviewed David first. His demeanor was calm, though there was an undercurrent of impatience. He insisted that Maria had been under stress lately, mentioning the tension between her and Abigail, but downplayed any suggestion that their relationship was particularly volatile. He suggested that Maria might have left on her own accord, perhaps needing space to clear her mind. But Bryce was skeptical. There was something about the way David spoke, too measured, too careful. Her instincts told her there was more beneath the surface, though nothing in his initial statement provided any concrete leads. Abigail Lawson's interview, conducted later that day, revealed little. The teenager, as expected, was quiet, almost robotic in her responses. She claimed she had last seen Maria the morning before her father returned. According to Abigail, Maria had been in the kitchen, making coffee. They had exchanged a few words, nothing more. Abigail had then retreated to her room for most of the day, occupied with her schoolwork. When asked if she had noticed anything unusual, Abigail shook her head. Bryce noted Abigail's flat affect, the lack of emotion, even when asked directly about her stepmother's disappearance. It was unusual, but not enough to raise immediate alarm. Teenagers often react differently to trauma, especially those who have experienced significant loss, like Abigail had with her mother's death. However, Abigail's statement raised more questions than it answered. The housekeeper, who had worked at the mansion on March 20th, offered a different account. She had seen Abigail lingering near the attic stairs that afternoon, watching the locked door with an intensity that unnerved her. The housekeeper also mentioned hearing voices later that night, though she couldn't say for certain where they had come from. By March 23rd, the search for Maria had expanded beyond Grey Haven. Search teams combed the cliffs and woods surrounding the Lawson estate. Drones and search dogs were deployed to cover the rugged terrain, but no trace of Maria was found. The waters near the cliffs were also searched, though the rough tides made it difficult to recover anything substantial. During the investigation, several items in the house drew Bryce's attention, the first being the attic. Maria's journal, found in the master bedroom, indicated that she had grown increasingly suspicious of the attic's contents in the weeks before her disappearance. She had written briefly about hearing noises coming from above, despite the door being locked, and had repeatedly asked David about opening it. His refusal, always explained away with excuses, had unsettled her. On March 24th, Bryce obtained a warrant to open the attic. When it was unlocked, the officers found boxes of old photographs, furniture, and personal effects that had belonged to Claire Lawson. But something else stood out: a series of notebooks tucked away in a large chest. These belonged to Abigail. The notebooks were filled with drawings, dark, unsettling images of faces twisted in pain, shadowy figures looming over the house, and one recurring symbol, a single eye, always drawn above the attic door. The discovery of the drawings raised immediate red flags. Abigail's apparent obsession with the attic and its contents took on a new significance, suggesting she may have known more about Maria's state of mind, and possibly her fate, than she let on. When Bryce confronted Abigail with the drawings on March 25th, the girl remained emotionless, denying any connection between her sketches and Maria's disappearance. She claimed the drawings were simply art, a way to express her emotions, but offered no further explanation. As the investigation stretched into April, more troubling details about the Lawson family began to surface. Detectives uncovered an old police report from 2013, 2 years after Claire's death, detailing an incident involving Abigail and a fellow student at her school in Bar Harbor. The student had accused Abigail of stalking her, describing strange notes and unsettling encounters where Abigail would appear at her house, staring through windows. While the incident had been dismissed at the time as teenage mischief, it now seemed like a warning sign, a precursor to something far more disturbing. By April 10th, with no solid leads on Maria's whereabouts, the case grew colder. David's behavior became increasingly erratic as public scrutiny intensified. He withdrew from the investigation, limiting his cooperation and refusing further interviews. Some of the town's residents began to talk more openly about the Lawson family, about the rumors surrounding Claire's death, about the uneasy relationship between David and Maria. As the days passed and Maria Lawson's disappearance remained unsolved, the case began to gather more attention. By late April 2021, with search efforts yielding no results, public interest in the case started to wane. But for Detective Eleanor Bryce, the unanswered questions surrounding Maria's vanishing kept the investigation alive. The mansion on the cliffs of Grey Haven had become a focal point, its heavy silence concealing secrets that only now began to emerge. On April 26th, Bryce returned to the mansion to review the attic once more. The unsettling drawings found earlier had left an impression, particularly the repeated image of the single eye above the attic door. As Bryce sifted through the attic's remaining contents, she found an old storage chest tucked into a far corner, buried under a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Inside were several more notebooks, this time belonging to Claire Lawson. Claire had kept detailed accounts of her life in the house leading up to her death, and as Bryce read through the pages, she uncovered something shocking. Claire had written extensively about her growing fear of Abigail in the final months of her life. One entry from July 2011, just weeks before her fatal accident in Acadia National Park, described strange occurrences around the house, voices late at night, objects moving on their own, and Abigail's increasing detachment. In one passage, Claire recounted finding a series of letters Abigail had written, addressed to no one. The contents were cryptic, full of dark imagery, suggesting that Abigail had begun to fixate on the idea of her mother's death, even before it happened. Claire's descriptions painted a picture of a deeply troubled child, one whose emotional instability seemed to worsen as the weeks went on. More disturbing still was the fact that Claire had reached out to a therapist in Bar Harbor for help, but had canceled the appointment days before her death. A breakthrough came in the form of a witness, a former friend of Abigail's who had grown up in Bar Harbor. The friend, now living in Portland, came forward after seeing reports of Maria's case in the news. She provided crucial new information that shifted the investigation in a dramatic direction. According to the friend, Abigail had spoken to her in February 2021, just weeks before Maria went missing. Abigail had made disturbing comments about starting over and removing what's in the way. At the time, the friend hadn't thought much of it. Abigail had always been prone to strange, sometimes dark musings. But in the context of Maria's disappearance, the words took on a far more sinister meaning. The investigation took a more urgent turn on May 3, 2021, when Bryce received an anonymous tip. The caller, whose voice was muffled and distorted, claimed that Maria's body could be found near the cliffs behind the Lawson mansion. The tip was vague and offered no details, but it was enough to mobilize a full search of the area. This time, authorities expanded their search grid to include several of the lesser-known caves and crevices along the coastline. On the morning of May 5th, search teams made a grim discovery. A shallow grave was uncovered just half a mile from the mansion, hidden within a dense thicket of trees along the cliffs. Buried beneath layers of dirt and leaves were the skeletal remains of a woman. While initial identification was difficult due to the state of decomposition, items found at the scene, a wedding ring, a bracelet, and fragments of clothing, matched descriptions of what Maria had last been wearing on the day she was reported missing. It wasn't until May 9th, after forensic analysis, that the remains were positively identified as Maria Lawson. The discovery of Maria's body reignited the investigation. Attention now shifted to Abigail and David Lawson, both of whom had maintained their distance from the media throughout the ordeal. Bryce immediately filed for a search warrant of Abigail's room, and what was found only deepened the mystery. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard under Abigail's bed was a collection of objects, a lock of hair, a piece of Maria's clothing, and a small vial of an unknown substance. More disturbing was the discovery of a journal, meticulously detailed in Abigail's handwriting, describing her growing hatred for Maria. The entries, written in cold, clinical language, chronicled Abigail's obsession with getting rid of her stepmother, with chilling references to controlling her father's future and ensuring that nothing would stand in her way. David, when questioned again, remained outwardly cooperative, but seemed increasingly agitated by the investigation. He expressed disbelief that Abigail could be involved in anything so horrific, insisting that his daughter had been deeply affected by her mother's death and was misunderstood. However, his answers lacked the confidence he had once shown, and cracks in his calm demeanor began to show. By May 15, 2021, Abigail Lawson was officially named a person of interest in the case. Her erratic behavior, coupled with the disturbing evidence found in her room, raised enough suspicion to warrant further scrutiny. Abigail, however, remained emotionless during questioning, never acknowledging the evidence directly or offering any defense. She simply stared blankly at the investigators, as though none of it mattered. Despite Abigail's silence, the evidence continued to mount. Toxicology reports from the small vial found in her room revealed traces of a powerful sedative. It was unclear if this had been used on Maria, but the discovery of such a substance in Abigail's possession added to the growing suspicion. How much had David known? His reluctance to engage fully with the investigation had not gone unnoticed, and Bryce suspected that his loyalty to his daughter might have led him to overlook or even cover up some of the warning signs. With Abigail Lawson officially named as a person of interest in the investigation, the town of Grey Haven buzzed with quiet speculation. By late May 2021, the community had grown uneasy, especially after the discovery of Maria's body. Most of Grey Haven's residents had always kept their distance from the Lawson family, but now their suspicions turned into outright fear. The once respected family was at the center of a tragedy that seemed far darker than anyone had imagined. Detective Bryce continued to piece together the fragments of Maria's final days. Abigail's journal, the hair and clothing found in her room, and the toxicology report on the vial had built a damning case, but there was still no confession, no concrete link between Abigail and the crime. Bryce knew that without a direct admission or stronger forensic evidence, it would be difficult to bring the case to trial. Meanwhile, David Lawson's behavior had become increasingly erratic. By June 1st, he had cut off all contact with the media, refusing to give interviews or make public statements about the case. Neighbors described him as a man on edge, frequently seen pacing the cliffs behind the mansion, staring out at the ocean for hours. His business, once thriving, had started to falter, and his withdrawal from public life only fueled rumors that he had been more involved in Maria's disappearance than initially suspected. On June 6, 2021, Bryce received a call from a private investigator hired by Maria's family in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The investigator had uncovered an old therapist's report from July 2011, just weeks before Claire Lawson's death. The report, filed by Dr. Elizabeth Green of Bar Harbor, detailed a single session with Abigail, then only 7 years old. The session had been brief and unsettling. Abigail had refused to speak for the majority of the time, only breaking her silence to tell Dr. Green that Mommy is going away soon. Dr. Green had noted this in her report, but had not pursued the matter further after Claire canceled the follow-up appointments. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than the imagination of a troubled child. But now, a decade later, the report took on new significance. This chilling revelation gave Bryce the push she needed to move forward. On June 8th, a second search warrant was issued for the Lawson mansion, this time to comb through all of Abigail's electronic devices. Forensic experts recovered deleted files from Abigail's computer, including a series of encrypted emails sent to an unknown recipient. The emails, once decrypted, contained discussions of Maria's movements in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, as well as references to plans that Abigail had been making. The messages were vague, but their intent was clear. They alluded to a deliberate act, carefully calculated. The question of who Abigail had been communicating with loomed large. Bryce's team traced the IP addresses connected to the emails, eventually linking them to a proxy server located in New Jersey, designed to mask the true sender's location. The complexity of the setup suggested that Abigail, or someone helping her, had gone to great lengths to hide their tracks. By June 15, 2021, Bryce arranged to bring Abigail in for formal questioning. This time, Abigail was not as composed. When confronted with the emails and the therapist's report from 2011, her cold, emotionless facade began to crack. For the first time, Abigail appeared nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she was shown the evidence. During the interrogation, Bryce pressed harder, asking Abigail directly about the night Maria disappeared. Abigail initially maintained her silence, but as the questioning continued, she made a startling admission. In a low, detached voice, she said, "Maria was never supposed to be here. This house was meant for us, for my father and me. She was in the way." Abigail's confession, though not a direct admission of murder, was enough to implicate her in the premeditated nature of Maria's death. But there was still something missing, some piece of the puzzle that hadn't yet fallen into place. Then, in an unexpected twist, the investigation uncovered a new player. On June 20th, 2021, Bryce's team tracked down a series of financial transactions linked to a bank account under Abigail's name. These transactions, made in March 2021, included several payments to a man named Peter Dalton, a known figure in the criminal underworld in New Jersey. Dalton, a man with a history of illegal activity, including extortion and contract work, had been flagged by the authorities before but had never been directly tied to violent crimes. When Dalton was brought in for questioning on June 23rd, he denied any involvement with Abigail, claiming the payments were for unrelated matters. However, further investigation into his phone records showed that he had been in contact with Abigail several times in the days leading up to Maria's disappearance. The connection between Abigail and Dalton was now undeniable. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. Abigail, with Dalton's help, had orchestrated Maria's murder. The emails, the payments, and Abigail's cold admission all pointed to a carefully plotted scheme to remove her stepmother from the equation. Bryce now had the crucial piece she needed to make an arrest. On June 25, 2021, Abigail Lawson was formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and Peter Dalton was arrested as her accomplice. The news sent shockwaves through Grey Haven. The quiet, introverted teenager who had lived in the shadow of her mother's death was now at the center of a murder conspiracy that had torn her family apart. David Lawson, upon hearing of his daughter's arrest, collapsed. He was taken to Maine Medical Center in Portland, suffering from what doctors described as extreme emotional distress. When questioned again by police, David maintained his innocence, claiming he had no knowledge of Abigail's plans. But some in the town speculated that David's guilt went deeper, that he had ignored the warning signs and allowed his daughter's obsessions to spiral out of control. By July 2021, the trial of Abigail Lawson and Peter Dalton began, capturing national attention. Abigail, once a quiet teenager, was now painted as the mastermind behind Maria's murder. Dalton, a hired accomplice from New Jersey, had been paid through Abigail's secret withdrawals from an account left by her mother, Claire Lawson. The prosecution presented damning evidence: Abigail's journal detailing her hatred for Maria, emails referencing Maria as the obstacle, and payments to Dalton. Abigail's motive became clear: a desire to remove Maria and restore her exclusive relationship with her father. Dalton's role was revealed through bank records and phone logs linking him to the murder plot. The defense argued Abigail's psychological trauma from Claire's death had left her vulnerable to Dalton's manipulation, but the prosecution countered by emphasizing Abigail's cold and calculated nature. Expert testimony suggested sociopathic tendencies, pointing to her lack of remorse. On August 10, 2021, Abigail was found guilty of conspiracy and accessory to murder. Dalton was convicted of first-degree murder. Both received life sentences, with Abigail tried as an adult despite her age. She showed no emotion at her sentencing. David Lawson, shattered by the trial, moved away from Grey Haven, expressing deep regret for not recognizing the warning signs in his daughter. The mansion stood empty, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Following the trial, Grey Haven returned to its quiet routine, but the Lawson case left an indelible mark on the town. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and history, was now seen as cursed. Local residents whispered about the darkness that seemed to envelop the family, the house standing empty on the cliffs like a shadow of the tragedy. David Lawson disappeared from public view, selling the mansion in September 2021 and moving to Boston. In the few interviews he gave, he admitted feeling haunted by guilt, blaming himself for not being more involved in Abigail's life after Claire's death. He struggled to reconcile the image of his daughter with the person responsible for Maria's murder. Abigail, now serving a life sentence, remained a mystery even behind bars. Reports from prison officials described her as quiet and unremarkable, showing little emotion, much like during the trial. She neither spoke about her crime nor showed any sign of remorse, becoming an enigma to both authorities and those who followed the case. The case, while officially closed, continued to linger in the public's mind. True crime enthusiasts and investigative journalists dissected the events for months, fascinated by the chilling coldness with which Abigail carried out her plan. Dalton's involvement, though integral, faded into the background, overshadowed by the image of a teenage girl who had orchestrated the destruction of her family.